All right. Welcome everyone to our second week of the 12th Soil and Nutrition Conference. Our theme this year is still renaturing ourselves. Um, I'm extremely happy to have Mark Cohen on today. I'd say he's probably the one who's most responsible for um, the fermenting of this thought and this idea. Um, over the last number of years, which is now culminated in this conference. His long and deep experience, um, thought, action, he's a very wise elder. He's been a one of our elders in the BFA for more than 10 years, active chapter leader, and has an immense amount to offer. We only have 2 hours today. I'm sure we could probably do 6 or 8 hours with him and maybe begin to have unpacked most of the pieces that he has. So we're gonna take off and go for it. I sent an email out yesterday with the recording of what he had presented in 2019, which I think is a great foundation at our conference 2019, which is a great foundation for today's conversation. But Mark, if you don't mind turning your camera and your audio back on, we can get started. Good to see you.
Yes, yes. Good to see you as well. Thanks for the opportunity here. I appreciate all your hard work to pull this community of folks all over the world together. Um, yeah, so we'll at least open things up and see how far we can get, and whatever we miss, we'll pick up later, I suppose, because
Pick up later.
there's probably hundreds of rabbit holes to go down, and I'll
Yeah,
open a few up for you. But yeah, so
great.
let's see, where do you want to start?
I think I'll just let you take it. I'll turn my camera and phone off and audio off for a little while, and whenever you're ready to bring me back in, um, give me a shout. But you've got, yeah, I think you've got a bunch of places you want to go to, so I'll just let you go.
Okay, very good. Uh, I'm not going to do too long of a background. I think that I'll just say that I've been kind of in the field, starting off with sort of the macro biological systems and the human relationships to them for a good 45 years now. I'm coming to you from the unglaciated hills of Southern Ohio, um, where I've been off the grid for 45 years and growing everything I possibly can. Spent 25 years in the jungles of Central America with basically machetes, and the theme has been basically to take away the subsidies that we have that are very hard to become aware of. And so nothing like just going back to sunlight and rainfall and soil and seeds to do that. So in all this work, I've been going to conferences for about that much time as well. And there was always this kind of assumption that we were going to be training up the next crew and gaining momentum and so forth. And of late, I've been wondering where all these new farmers and stewards are. And I'm not saying there aren't any, but the numbers haven't increased. And just like in a soil test, when we're looking for limiting factors, I started looking deeper. And corresponding with this, since the last 2019 conference where we met in person, which I miss, I did two talks. One was another really out of the box one that Dan didn't put up, I don't think, but you can easily find it, called Psychological Compatibility with Diversity, and some of the internal processes that make us comfortable or uncomfortable with tremendous amounts of complexity. And that I did with a couple other friends. It's a panel discussion, and I think it's worth listening to as well, because it was the beginning of kind of looking at neurobiology as a foundational piece of all this. So the other two pieces that happened since 2019 is that I got a grant to work in 6 inner city locations teaching regenerative agriculture, which when they asked me when I asked them, what does that mean to you? They said, well, you can use your own your own definition of that. I don't think they knew who they were talking to. It was very good, but it was fascinating to me working with a population of people who have no safety net, no food security, and are really wide open to change, unlike comfortable people, and the so-called choir even. So this was really facilitating a lot to me because it forced me to back way up below the level of affluence, below the level of assumptions that I had previously made when working with people. And I'll get into that in a minute in terms of like where the low-hanging fruit is, but basically there's a couple things that I've noticed, and I'll try to convey them. I've looked into the eyes of a tiger in a zoo, and you see this look, which is becoming more and more common as I look around at a number of species that have been captured, caged, denatured in the context of this conference. I very much resonate with this theme, and I think, as Dan said, I've seen some of my language in his description of it. And it's really not possible to denature ourselves. We have to work hard to block out circuitry that we have. We're really built for this this whole interconnection. And so, on the other hand, I've looked into the eyes of wild cats in the jungle and seen a different look, and seen the same look in people in inner city and indigenous people in their setting where they're just right in their habitat. So this is kind of where I began, which was an analysis of habitat quality, of looking at the carrying capacity of landscapes, the quality of life, and the capacity to support any given species. So I found myself needing to talk to folks in the city about all these things that we can do with agriculture, and lots of empowering ideas and things but as I looked around, I very quickly saw that there were problems with at a essentially a mitochondrial, metabolic, and health level, which was all riddled with anxiety and trauma and numerous other toxins and so forth. And so I had to back up a bit and look at where are the low-hanging fruit of things that they could do, because for the most part, a lot of people will tend to respond to the conversation with, I don't have the time and I can't afford it. So essentially, I had to back up to the point of saying, in these rooms, what I would walk into is, raise your hand if you're going to breathe in the next 10 minutes. And so a couple good things about that. One is it's very inclusive. Two is it's super low-hanging fruit. So where we go to from there is that the breath and breath work, retention breathing, you can take that as far as you want into the Vedic pranayama and many techniques there. I was just trying to keep it very simple for them and show them a retention breathing process that takes minutes to bank nitric oxide in your bloodstream. And that's super important, because if you take any animal and you stress it out, and this is high stress. I mean, everybody has versions of this, but I was in a pretty intense version of it. And stress should be understood to be in two types. There's eustress and distress. And so we're trying to get around the distress. Eustress is a kind of stress that makes you stronger. And it induces hormesis and other healing processes as you solve problems, as you build a basis for future problem solving and so forth. And so this other distress basically moves any animal into a state of fight or flight, which is the sympathetic nervous system. And we need to escape that trap, because I think it's a tremendous number of people. It's a great thing. It's an evolutionary adaptation for very dangerous situations that you can run and fight and liberate energy from your immune system, from your digestive system, and so forth, in order to survive the next 3 to 5 minutes. And if you don't, then the immune system and digestion have no meaning. So, but if it's chronic stress, if it's chronic cortisol production in that state of sympathetic nervous system, you're literally poisoning yourself. So we got to get out of that one first. And there's a whole series of tools that go outward from there. And I don't want to get too granular. But the second question I ask people is, okay, so what, but before I move on to that, is by getting nitric oxide in your bloodstream, you can move yourself into the parasympathetic part of the nervous system. And that's more of the rest and regeneration phase of the two. So the second question is, how many people, raise your hand if you can walk outside and take off your shoes? So then we get into a conversation about light and biophotomodulation or photobiomodulation. Anyway, there's a series of pathways by which light is extremely important to us. And this is a type of nourishment that we can miss if we're just looking at nutrients in food. And I'll get into a lot of other pieces that we're missing as well when we're kind of turning food into a commodity. And this is a lot more than food. It's about nourishment and spiritual nourishment. So, for example, the light, the two things that I mentioned, having sunlight, which is about half infrared light, and standing barefoot on the ground, this electrical grounding and banking electrons, the two of those things combined literally starts to change the structure of the water in your body, which is 99% of your molecules, 60 to 70% of the volume of your body is water. And if people aren't familiar with Gerald Pollack's work on the fourth phase of water, I would highly recommend it. And he's got a new book coming out as well. So that's one piece. There's another one that I won't go into, but it's worth exploring if you're into these kinds of things. And it has to do with melanin, of another potential pathway for photosynthesis in animals. But the other thing is vitamin D from the UVB in the sunlight, and some other aspects of light that are important. And then as you move out from there, there's more to talk about water, with not just the water structuring, but the quality of the water you're drinking, and how other things in the diet that can induce this fourth phase with this gel state, which is a H3O2 hexagonal structure that is hydrophilic and hugs the tissues of your body, lining of your arteries and capillaries, and all the liquid and fascia of the body. And that appears to me to be facilitating communication. Fritz Albert Pop's work back in, I believe, as early as the late 70s and 80s was able to identify photon emission from living cells. And the frequency of that light was able to be measured, and a difference in frequency between tumors and healthy cells. The reason why I think this is important is that our body needs to know in real time at the speed of light every cell in it, from bone marrow to eyeballs, and what it is. And this is a kind of a level of information that's beyond classic genetics. And so there's that piece. Again, I'll leave that there. We can go further in questions if we need to. So then we finally get to nutrition and the whole ATP cycle and food, and this group is very familiar with that. But I don't start with yet with growing and buying food. I start with foraging. There's a tremendous amount of free food available in most landscapes. Basically the hunter-gatherer mode, which we spent probably 99% of our time as primates in. And our bodies recognize those our bodies recognize in general the proportions of compounds in food that's whole and real, as opposed to isolated nutrients and processed food and so forth. So there's a whole world of interaction with foraging that's, you know, pretty far beyond buying something in a package in a store and preparing it. There's, you know, digging in, you know, for tubers. There's fishing and hunting and, you know, cutting greens and in the forest, in the grasslands, in the ecosystem. And really what we're talking about here is engagement and embodiment, and really beginning to stretch out our sense of self. And this neurological, neurobiological system is beautifully built to interface with what we're calling nature, which is just one massive superorganism, whether you want to call it God or nature or you know, any of those terms are fine with me. But the single question is it all connected? And if it is, then that's the thing. As we're interacting with these things, you know, we're tasting, we're smelling, we're using our five senses, and then we're moving beyond, whether we're conscious of it or not. Our bodies are full of receptors that are picking up neurotransmitters. They're picking up hormones, pheromones, electromagnetic signals. There's a whole world of communication going on if we want to reboot our dashboard. I feel like collectively over time, in the modernization phase, that we just kind of went in and cut the wires of feedback that wasn't convenient in terms of commodifying things and marketing things and kind of getting number and number to the relationships that are behind all of that. And so I think what we're talking about here is re-energizing, reconnecting and communicating. And some of the ideas about what we're really doing there is, I think the concept of balance comes into play, because really almost maybe all imbalance can be traced back to some type of nature deficit disorder, which is what I generally am seeing, you know, and traveling around and trying to work and upgrade on farms. I also have been inspecting thousands of organic farms over the last 35 years, and getting feedback from their plants and animals, and looking at soil tests and techniques and what's working and what's not working. It's been a fantastic education. So balancing is really what nature does. If you stand back from the process and you look over time, as ecosystems, as life forms mature, they're buffering extremes. They're buffering extreme winds and temperatures. If you walk into you know, a hot day, you know, like today, it's not that hot here, but, you know, on a hot day, if you walk into the forest, it's instantly 10 to 15 degrees cooler. In the same forest on a really cold day, it's probably that amount warmer. So that's just one example. So balance is a big piece, you know, and I think that, you know, we'll be looking at a lot of the tools that I would kind of consider adaptogenic. You know, in a way, compost is an adaptogen for the soil. It moves the pH toward a balance, whether it's high or low, just as an example. But there are lots of plants and herbs and allies that we can use to balance most things that we would come up with that we see are out of balance. Another concept that's really important is coherence. I'll talk a little bit about that in terms of some, what I think is like an astounding scientific breakthrough. And I'll go into that in a minute. Basically diversity, you know, as you diversify the soil, the gut microbiome, the landscape, speciation, the genetic variation within the species, the total speciation, the diversity of vertical structure above and below ground, the diversity at all levels. I could go further into that, but I have more to go here. So decentralization is another piece. It seems to me that concentration of power is always violent, and the distribution of power, distribution of the generation of food over a wide area on every piece of land where people are eating it, takes out those packaged supply chains that are deriving cost packaging. They're losing nutrients. They're often losing soil because they're large scale in order to, because people aren't doing it themselves, they're buying it from another source. And that happens with electricity, that happens with water, that happens with virtually everything that we do. So living off the grid is a very good practice of kind of creating alternatives to those large scale centralized processes. So decentralization is another piece. Another piece that's really important, I think much more usable than sustainability, is resilience, and looking at what is it in the body, what is it in on the farm, in your soils and systems in general. So I'm generally working with about 5 levels. You could change them out, but the first level that I'm going to be going into today more is the neurobiological base level of the self. And then the next level up would be the home, farm, family. And then the next would be community, which is, plant and animal communities, human communities, some, geographically near each other, some not, like this community. And then the bioregion, which is more kind of watersheds, biological regions that are unique and generally define the best methods of doing agriculture or medicine or architecture or anything else in terms of design. So resilience is a really big one. We can look at metrics for all of these as well. And then, so then you go up from the bioregion to the biosphere, with all the bioregions of the planet knitted together into this miraculous, region of life that surrounds this planet and goes pretty far deep into it and pretty far up into the atmosphere. And so another term I think is valuable, because we tend to see ourselves as isolated, and I think that the isolation is a part of the disease. It doesn't exist there. Where is the line between the self and nature? And as we look closer and closer, there really isn't one. It's a made up thing, and it's a unhealthy thing. So we can follow that out as well. But that kind of goes into co-regulation of all sorts of methods that nature co-regulates our nervous systems and our health. And you see examples of this in nursing homes by bringing in a therapy animal and putting a dog or a cat on someone's lap. There's zillions of examples of this. But as we add pieces of nature back into that tiger cage of that neurotic pacing back and forth, that look that's longing for something, what is it longing for? It's longing for what its body and its whole being knows, which is this habitat, which are the plants and animals, and what it's familiar with is what we're all looking for. And so, that's that. To just finish that up, it's connection and communication, and as those things happen, this larger being becomes aware of itself, and that's who we are. So there's territory that's hard to get at with the English language. There's a word in the northern Japanese indigenous people called the Ainu. It's a word called iwaru, and it doesn't exist in English, but it's a very complex word that kind of translates to territory or region, but it's kind of simultaneously a biological landscape, a cultural landscape, and a spiritual landscape. It contains the portion of the ocean that the salmon go out and feed. It contains the upper watersheds and rivers where they come up and breed. It contains the nutrient flow of the bears that ate them and dragged them up into the forest. It's the songs, the dances, the recipes, the food of these people. And so it's not a negotiable concept in most of these indigenous ideas. And you'll find something like this, all over the world. It's, again, where we come from. It's home. It's the habitat that we're looking for. In the book Heart of the World, I spent some time in Tibet, and I was really moved by my experience there, and read Ian Baker's book Heart of the World, and he talks about the mythology of Shangri-La in the Himalaya. And I think it was a beautifully written book that shows the simultaneous geographical and psychological nature of this territory. I think that's also a bit useful. So cover a little bit of territory there. I guess we're going to leave questions for later. There's lots more to go on here. Let's talk a little bit about coherence within the nervous system. There's coherence with all of the other beings and so forth, but I think we need to basically create a safe space for ourselves within our own nervous system, become comfortable in our own skin. And there's a whole deal going on between the left and the right brain. We seem to have an educational system. I would call it an educational system or a brainwashing system, unfortunately, because it alienates people at a very early age to this other part of the brain that we don't engage properly. I mean, we were talking about the left and the right brain, and the example I would use is if you took a young cow that was spent its life on a pasture of 6 to 8 species and a few hundred chemical compounds, and flew it to North Dakota and put it on a pasture of 250 species and over 100,000 chemical compounds, you don't see it go into a tizzy. So the idea here is that and I think this is really close to the end game as far as where we're heading with all this in terms of being autonomous, in terms of really using our nervous. So the reason why I think this is really important is that we're going into a time of incredible manipulation of the facts. We saw this during COVID. We're now seeing, we're just at the front end of what's going to go down with AI, whatever that is. And I think we need to be able to navigate and trust in something more than what we're being led down this road with technology is doing. So this inner nervous system piece is huge. And so what I mentioned about the equivalent of a Brix meter for the nervous system, there's a group called the Heart Math Institute, and they have produced a little thing called Inner Balance, and it clips on your ear and it shows you your heart rate variability, which is the best indicator of your vagus nerve, which is the whole combination of your full brain, your heart, and your gut all combined. And it's a 12-layer nerve that communicates bidirectionally all the time. And so that's a really big piece that also ties into kind of moving beyond the trauma and polyvagal theory. Stephen Porges's work is worth looking at as well on this. Seems like everybody's got some kind of dings, and it's a little bit like the other pieces of the terrain, and I'm hoping to get to the terrain theory of health. Got a number of other pieces connected to that, which we're into. So that's a simple tool that you can use to not only watch what's happening with your heart and your heart rate variability and the depth of the sine wave, and practice with your breathing and your embodiment of how you're occupying your body and your heart, and get that to be at a deeper sine wave with practice. It's also pinging you with a reading of coherence. between the brain and the heart. They haven't got to the gut yet. That's a big one. But the polyvagal theory is looks like heart rate variability is indicating that that part is functioning as well, and it pings you with three color options. One is green and you're in coherence, blue and you're moving into coherence or out of coherence, and red and you're out. So the beauty of this, it's like riding a bike. Basically, you can practice, you can get to feel what it's like to be in coherence, to be coherent versus to be out of coherence. And then the things you have to do with your breath and so forth, again, to practice to move from a lack of coherence into a coherent state. Once you get a good feeling for that and practice, you can give that tool to someone else, and you know how to ride your own bike now. It's like training wheels. So there's a kind of a world of stuff going on with this polyvagal theory. Let me talk about this movie Source. I don't know how many people have seen it yet. It was within the last year. It's a movie that was done about the Joe Dispenza community, of groups of over 1,000 that are basically being trained in heart-brain coherence and achieving some very interesting results. And the unique thing about this is that there's a team of scientists from the University of San Diego that studied these folks. They weren't kind of drinking the Kool-Aid. They were kind of looking from the outside in, but they were doing functional MRI maps of the brain of these people on day one. These are like 8-day gatherings. And on day one, they would do a functional MRI, and then again, through to day 8. And what they found, and they're also doing blood work during that same time, and the blood work was showing, changes in specific compounds and certain proteins that were being produced in this mental state. What it looks like to be in it, and the chemistry that goes downstream. I first became aware of this from Candace Pert. She wrote a book called The Molecules of Emotion, and looking at the chemistry in the blood created by different emotional states. And then again, Bruce Lipton's book on the biology of belief. So I was already a little bit primed on it. What it's really showing is what exactly is going on with the placebo effect. And it's basically when you get out of your own way, when you believe fully. And I think it's the one thing that science has not been able to do, which is to leave its skepticism at the door of the experiment and fully believe in something that you would normally be skeptical of, which changes the outcome of the experiment. So this is kind of moving into a territory of spontaneously healing all sorts of things, from cancers to, activating stem cells and regrowing different parts of the body that can regenerate, and so forth. So I think this is massive, and what it's kind of pointing to is a state that you can go into where all things are possible, or at least a lot more than previously was. And there's other themes of this, in energy, in quantum entanglement, quantum physics, scalar energy, and there's different terminology, 0-point energy, and so forth. There's a fascinating couple things to look into if this kind of triggers your interest. One is the pistol shrimp. It's a 1-inch shrimp in the ocean that looks to be breaking the first and second law of thermodynamics. It can create a snap underwater so intensely that it creates sonoluminescence. And I don't have time to go too much into it, other than that the energy that it's exerting is creating tremendous amounts of energy that isn't clear where it came from. And so there's a few other examples. There's the pistol shrimp. There's there's another YouTube video, people want to look at it, called A Star in a Jar, where somebody was able to induce this same phenomenon using sound frequencies. And then there's another guy that did an experiment in Maine that was able to replicate it as well. So the point being, there's this potential to go beyond what we previously thought was possible. We've known about faith healing. We've known about all sorts of things that couldn't be replicated. I think we're on the verge of being able to replicate some of these things. Saw something very interesting recently in this interaction with plants. In this case, it's happening with animals and all of life. And I think I mentioned exosomes. If I didn't, I was moving toward that. But it's kind of like the mother of all interspecies communication. That there are these lipid nanoparticles that contain messenger microRNA that is being communicated across all kingdoms of life. Every type of life form that has cells that we know of. So there's another pretty big rabbit hole. But I saw a very interesting article recently of some Israeli scientists that were studying flowers, and were able to see that that the flowers are listening, that the flower is actually like an ear. And these were evening primroses. It's not clear if all flowers do this, but they were able to see that in the presence of the pollinator of the flower could upcycle its sugar content very rapidly within 3 minutes, because it's very expensive to keep the sugar content up that high all the time if the pollinators are not around. And then, of course, the bees are attracted to the higher sugar content. The scout bees are taking samples back to the hive, and they're checking the sugar content and the quantities and doing the waggle dance and so forth and so on. So they're hanging out their advertisement of themselves and changing it when they hear the pollinator in this case. So what else do they hear? What else is going on out there? It seems to be endless and only limited by the time we have for observation. So this kind of gets into this large conversation, let's call it. And a lot of us have known about this conversation through the entheogenic plants from very early. And so it's not a real big surprise. But I guess where I was going with the left and the right brain piece, there's an interesting book there. People want to look into it, called Return to the Brain of Eden. And we talked about this in the 2019 talk with Reginaldo Hazlet-Marroquin and Guido Masse. That's worth a listen. So I won't go too much into that, but because it looks like it's an old song and dance. It's been going on for a very long time. And in the Eastern Hemisphere, the cultural wisdom was pointed towards meditation techniques, essentially. And in the Western Hemisphere, it was more about entheogenic plants, shamanic use of plants. So if we can bring our left and right brain together to work together instead of opposing each other and balance each other, if we can then get our brain, heart, and gut working together, once you get to the gut, you're kind of home free into the soil and into the plants and animals and the whole biosphere. But then there's the conscious and the subconscious. I think one of the things that's been happening, in my opinion, is that we've been sweeping a lot under the rug and telling ourselves a story that's not true, and our subconscious is kind of calling BS on it. And this massive increase of anxiety. There's 70 million people in the United States on psychiatric medications. I think that the subconscious is knows more than we think it does, and it's calling us out. I think collectively, we can't really hide from that, and we shouldn't want to try. We need to make peace with that, and that should be part of our dashboard as well. And so I think when we start lining a lot of these things up, it's fascinating if you look into the flow state, and the things that trigger it. The first big trigger is this deep embodiment. The second big trigger is complex landscape that's not like go on green and stop on red sidewalks. It's variable landscapes where you got to put your foot down differently every time. And the third big trigger is real danger, where it's so steep. You've caught a 50-foot wave, or you're on you're rock climbing in the mountains. A lot of the extreme sports folks are triggering this. We probably all had it happen at some time in our lives. But what's really interesting about it is that it triggers a whole cascade of neurotransmitters in the body. And I think we're not going to have time on this talk, but I do think that it has a lot to do with, it ties into addiction. And this would take me a little bit of time, but basically, like norepinephrine, dopamine, anandamide, serotonin, and endorphins, it's like the faucets open up when you're in this state. And so it's there's like 4 phases of it. There's like the struggle, stress I mentioned earlier, sympathetic nervous system, fight or flight. There are beta brain waves involved, cortisol, and then as you get into this release phase, which is what I mentioned with the breath, the nitric oxide, and the movement towards sympathetic nervous system, it goes into alpha, and dopamine, endorphins, and anandamide are triggered. The alpha waves are interesting because it tends to be a common meditative state that you see an analog with the planet. There's a 60-mile zone above the surface of the planet where all of the electrical storms on Earth are generating a standing wave of 7.83 hertz, which is a very, very close to the alpha state in meditation. So we're basically lining up with this bigger process when we're doing that. So then the third stage is the flow state, and that's more theta and gamma waves. You get more lateral thinking, and then that settles down into a recovery phase of delta brain waves and serotonin, oxytocin, so it's kind of like a big loop. But I think that one of the things that you find in the flow state is you have a higher degree of access to novelty, and which is one of the 2 pieces of creativity. Now, when you really need to find something out, and you need to, it's a lot like dowsing. I've been a dowser for a long time and have focused mostly on primary energy fields in landscapes and looking at temple sites all over the world, and the mound builders and the Chaco culture and the Mayan temples in Central America and the Tibetan temples and megalithic sites in Europe. And there is a profound overlap of what it's a very primary map of the landscape. And as you observe it closer, you start seeing the animal behavior that relates to that. Like anthills have always been on the yin lines, the water lines. If you're a water dowser, you're looking for those types of lines. There's 2 other types of lines that are more yang, and these are in the East talked about as the dragon and the tiger. In Central America, it's the serpent and the jaguar, corollary. And so these tiger lines or jaguar lines are associated with temples, And then the second line is like a track line, which is more associated with animal tracks, trails, and archaeological roads, and so forth. I don't want to get too much more esoteric than that, but basically, when we're trying to find a medicine to heal a family member or ourselves, I happen to be in that zone, which is another factor of my personal situation right now. It's pushed me into this kind of terrain theory of health or disease. Lots of the holistic healers are talking about this. Naisha Winters, a lot of you might know, is really a strong vocal advocate of this. In other words, why do some people not get sick from the same germ that somebody else did? So the terrain theory, the quick rundown is, genetic, epigenetic, number one, blood sugar balance, number two, which is like you don't want to have big glucose spikes. I'm in ketosis for about a month now, in therapeutic level ketosis. It's a whole other conversation. Very, very interesting. Toxics, getting rid of toxic compounds, heavy metals, and other toxics using binders and clay and activated charcoal and zeolites and things like that. 4 would be the microbiome. 5, the immune system. These things obviously overlap. A lot of the immune system is in the microbiome. Modulating inflammation, another big one, and the grounding that I mentioned earlier is a really good start on that. Increasing circulation, well, I'll just leave it there. The other parts are more for specifically cancer. Hormone balancing, stress, and enhanced mental and emotional wellness. So we addressed a lot of those, and I think that there's an opportunity here to stretch them out into that territory of the talk, Dan, that you mentioned from 2019 that I got into, that I'm sure I don't have time to go into. But there's a lot of leverage points here. I think that, if we can get to the point of a functional neurological system and get our mitochondrial energy up and have the energy to tackle these problems, we've made a massive step. And using nutrition and all of the other techniques I mentioned, and really listening to the plants and getting that feedback loop and building the relationships to them are very therapeutic. If we can get that energy up, then we're not going to be fazed by any level of challenge. And if we don't have it, we're going to give up very quickly, I think. And so the second big lever is community. The second big lever is a group of people all coordinatedly working on a project together, and that is a massive lever. And having lived in a community land trust for 45 years and been involved with a number of co-ops, it's not a picnic. It's difficult, but going extinct is pretty difficult as well. So we shouldn't be daunted by it, even though it's like, shoveling pig shit out of the barn, as far as I'm concerned, is not my favorite thing. But when you can get to 1 + 1 = 3 in a human group dynamic, it's a very big lever of getting a lot done. There's other levers that we can talk about. There's a lot to talk about with water. I think that the work of Michael Krabchick and Walter Jena with the small water cycle. We have a whole watershed in our bodies. As I mentioned earlier, with the phase changes of water, the communication that's happening in it, and so on. Also, carbon, the biochar. I'm continually blown away every time I think about what these indigenous people in the Amazon did. It's a little bit like the concept of the atlatl, being able to extend the physics of the human arm to throw a spear much farther than it could. They were throwing carbon through time, essentially, thousands of years into the future in these soils. So we can identify a lot of these tools and really lean on them in this time of great change. Let's see. I think I might have covered. I guess I'll also just quickly say that that when dealing with whole systems, with these, opening up these wild systems and understanding them better, that Aldo Leopold's saying of the first law of intelligent tinkering is to save all the parts, and that's really kind of what we're talking about here, is bringing all the parts together, connecting these dots, and relieving suffering, essentially. And I think that decentralizing power in many ways does that. Living in a landscape where all of our ingredients and all of our energy and our source of heat, our medicine, our food, and we have a direct relationship with those things, is pretty habit forming. I mean, it would be hard for me to imagine not doing that. And I wish I could had a better signal strength, because I could take you through the landscape a little bit and show you some amazing plants. I've got a couple things here. If we have the bandwidth, I can show you. But Dan, I think we might. I don't know what our time frame is looking like. I can certainly go further, but we might want to start looking at some questions.
Yeah, we're just about at an hour. So if you want to,
Oh, okay.
I can start engaging you with a little bit of
Yeah,
sort
let's
of
do that.
unpacking, and
It
then
could be, always can be taken further, but that was a fair bit.
um,
uh,
it would take someone with an immense amount of perspective to even know the references that you were referring to. So I feel like this is a a 500 level you know dissertation you've just shared with us, and to the degree that I can sort of bring down to earth into practical lay speak some of these references that you were making, I think that'll be success. Um, I would invite again people attendees to start putting your questions that you would like us to address into the Q&A box. Welcome to keep commenting still in the chat box, but I can certainly we'll start to interrogate you, Mark, if that's okay. Do you want to try to turn your camera back on, see if that?
I did. I think Shauna turned it off. I was going to try to show you a interesting thing I picked this morning, real quick, because it's just cool. But
Okay.
I don't know if we could try it, I suppose, and see. That last little window did seem better.
It seemed like it
Okay, I'm
was
going to
bad for a
try
few
it.
minutes there, but it's yeah. All right.
I don't know if you can see this.
Not yet. Oop.
It's it's a
Yes.
it's a snake gourd, and it's basically in an Ouroboros, a snake biting its own tail, or an infinity sign. It's a really interesting vegetable I've just grown this year for the first time, now that I have a hoop house. And it's delicious. It stores in the refrigerator for longer than any other cucurbit that I've grown. The flowers are stunning and are wonderful scent at night to attract moths into the garden. And I'll just show you one other quick thing. I've got, two things. So this spring, as close as I could shoot an arrow from where I'm sitting right now, I found a mastodon tusk, approximately 14,000 years old, just to give a sense of the time scales of things. The places that we live, they have long, deep histories. There was a local piece in the local paper about it, but also oddly, this is a piece of petrified wood from a tree fern that's 300 million years old, and I found at least a dozen of these in the exact same spot as the mastodon, which there's really no good rational explanation for that. There's an explanation for ice age fossils being washed together from the ice sheet that was melting about 40 miles north of here 12,000 years or so ago, there was a 1 mile at least thick sheet of ice, and these mastodons and mammoths and so forth were walking around right through this valley I'm living in here. So it's changed my imagination and it's lit it up, and I see things out of the corner of my eye now that are part of this place, but not necessarily right here and now. And it kind of calls into question this whole linear sense of time. Get into some of the Aboriginal, dream time and other concepts that peoples have had that are kind of on the other side of that quantum entanglement story as well. One last thing, and then we'll go into. This is a tomato I picked this morning, just a giant, more than 6 inches across. And that was in soil that had really nothing more than paramagnetic rock powders and not much more. And so I'm just blown away by what I'm seeing. It was a really important thing this year to have the high tunnel because we had a very wet spring and a lot of the plants outside didn't do very well. And particularly the tomatoes, which don't like to be wet. I learned that in the tropics. They don't like their leaves to be wet. They love water at the roots, but so anyway, I guess there was some biological inoculants in there. The three things that are running my show, I had corn last year that was 10.5 feet on the 4th of July with no fertilizers at all of any kind or manure in over 20 years, with just the minerals, cover crop, exudates, and cover crops turned in. And then these biological sprays. So I'll leave it there, and we'll go for some questions.
Yeah, I think people may have some context now if they hadn't watched your recordings from before about why I have so much appreciation and respect for your deep and broad perspective and insight. Yeah, it's almost impossible to begin to unpack from any one point, but I'd like to try to, at least to some basic degree. Uh, I think, when you and I have discussed this in the past, we've talked about the level of mitochondrial energy that people have, and you didn't explain that in depth. But if that could be an entry point into this conversation, what it is, what the implications are, and how to begin to build that back up again. Because I think, you know, just in the broader trajectory of things in this process of renaturing, you need to have not only the desire but the capacity and the energy. And I think one of the things that you've identified is that in many cases people are so worn down that they just physiologically do not have the capacity to act to change their lives. So would you mind just sort of starting there with just a couple minutes on what that is and how it happens and how it can be reversed, and that as a lens towards action?
Sure. Yeah, it's quite complex. I mean, ATP and digestion of food is really a big deal. I mean, it's why we've kind of coalesced around this organization. Uh, but there are these pathways that are prior to that, as I mentioned, with the sunlight and the potential for melatonin to be very significant with that. The other thing I think you alluded to is that the toxic compounds are blocking nutrients. Even if they're in the food, you're not getting them there. And this gets into the microbiome as well. So if you got a very diversified microbiome that's good at kind of getting rid of things that shouldn't be there and counterbalancing them, and adaptogens to move you into a state where your ability to process, digest food is really efficient. Those are all going to be coming into play in that swirl. And I'm sure there's others. I mean, there's EMFs, there's the blue light issues and circadian rhythms being scrambled, and the chronic cortisol that I mentioned earlier, if you're in that state, it suspends your digestion. So you could be eating the most nutrient-dense food in the world and not getting what's in it. So we need to look at the entire terrain. I think it's a worthwhile term. It's as good as any. And what I'm proposing here is that we expand that terrain together with the folks that are doing holistic healing, and build this. We've always known that food is medicine, and so it's a good opportunity to join arms with the healers of the world who are beginning to understand this. And so there's no reason to be reinventing wheels here with different groups. Part of this this whole process is communication and connection and understanding how we connect, and realizing ultimately that when you follow that question I asked earlier about where does the self leave off and this larger system begin, it's pretty clear we're all in the same boat and we're not getting out. You really can't, I wouldn't say escape, but you couldn't get out if you wanted to. We are eternal beings. We're going to keep coming back in some form, and we might as well make it the place better and better to come back to. That's kind of how it works, as far as I can tell.
Yeah.
So
I think,
I'm not.
Sorry.
No, I was going to say I'm not an expert on mitochondria, but that I think that is there's a whole lot going on there at the cellular level, and there's no question that this the fourth phase of water is coming into it, that there's a lot of different communicating molecules, that food as information, I think, is more accurate than food as nutrients. And so I think if we expand our understanding of what nourishment is, I remember having a conversation with Fred Provenza probably in 2014 or 15 at the Soil and Nutrition Conference, and it really kind of got me onto this track about what's going on with animal capacities for locating what it needs and how to fix itself when it needs to do that. That I think that within 5 years we're going to see that the only way through this is this intuitive pathway, which it always had been. The entire hunter-gatherer period, they had to figure stuff out in real time. They didn't have an exonervous system in their pocket to ask questions for everything. And the problem with that is that we become so dependent on it that when the satellites go down and the grid goes down, we're just like extremely unevolved creatures all of a sudden. And so I'm not a Luddite. I use technology. I just think that we need to understand the trade-offs and understand what we can do to not lose capacity by using it, by leaning on it like a crutch for too long, a lot like nitrogen would do. So to demotivate plants and soils to create its own nitrogen pathway because somebody's supplying nitrogen, as a analog or as an example of that,
as a metaphor concept. For this point. Yeah. So I feel like you're staying in the sort of the broad conceptual. I like to try to draw out practical, tactical, specific take homes for people. I don't know that you actually explained what mitochondrial energy is. Maybe you just presume everyone knows. I would say let's presume people don't know what that is, what its implications are, and then what are the, I heard you say at the very beginning, get outside, get sunlight, take off your shoes. But, what are some of these, and or you say community, we are in many cases, I think, experiencing a low level of energy, which connects with, and just an inability to take action and to move out of the ruts that we're in. I think this is a really important point, and maybe because it's so second nature to you, you're just running off with it. But let's assume not everyone has your basic understanding.
Well, I think as short a supply chain as possible for a whole bunch of reasons, but having these landscapes with so much diversity in them, with so many different compounds, and then unleashing our intuitive ideas about what we feel like we need right now. I just started growing a cultivar of purslane that I'm kind of blown away by what's going on with this plant. It's got two of the biggest evolutionary. It's got the C4 photosynthetic pathway, and it's got this big adaptation to drought. I think it's called CAB. And then it also might be the only one I know of, a plant that makes omega-3 fatty acids. And so if we optimize our diets based on super fresh with the water that's in these plants, when you study desert peoples, they're not drinking a lot of water. They're eating their water in plants. And in these plants is this fourth phase of water that Gerald Pollack's talking about. And these gels, which is really what this fourth phase of water is when we get grounded and get in the sunlight and so forth, are about. And there's all of that. And then there's a lot of hacks that we have right now with adaptogenic things. There's, stuff I'm trying because I've got like about another month before getting tested, and for some brain lesions that I have, and so my stakes are high for getting this right. And so I've been trying some things like methylene blue, which gets into a reset of your mitochondria, and so there's lots of things like that out there. I'm not going to advocate any of this stuff for reasons that are tricky to tell anybody what to do, but you can kind of look for yourself. There's a lot going on right now. It's a fascinating time. I don't know. It's just because of I'm highly motivated, but we get sent these challenges, and we have an opportunity to solve them and pass along what we learn. And if we communicate properly together, we can solve all these things, I think. Could be kidding myself, but I know that the odds are extreme right now, and I know enough to probably shatter everybody's bubble who's watching, but I won't. But basically, denial is something that is almost across the board happening. It's really difficult to take off the Band-Aid and look straight on at what's happening. And so my interest is in a couple of years ago, I came to your place. We had a conversation that was like about a day and a half.
Yeah.
And it's really about how to boot all these things up together in an experiential course. We could never touch this with any amount of Zoom calls in terms of getting it really done. But what happens face to face, embodiment in an environment where all these things are happening, it's unbelievable. I mean, I've watched it for over 30 years with lots of courses that I've done in Central America, in getting people out of the cult of reductionism and materialism and so forth, and looking back at the fishbowl of their lives from a distance. It does happen with psychoactive plants in a sense as well, but they're actually not required. There's no reason to rule them out, but it's not like necessary to get that kind of perspective. We can do this with curriculums. And in that, you can do all 5 upgrades, all the metrics that we didn't get into about, I gave you heart rate variability for a simple metric for the vagus nerve and so forth. But there's ones at community level, there's ones at bioregion, watershed level, and biosphere levels. And those can be accomplished simultaneously. If we do this linearly, one thing at a time, there's no way possible we could ever put a dent in the stuff that's coming at us, the rate that things are coming at us, the hyper novelty period that we're in. I believe that we have capacities that I haven't seen yet, and maybe nobody has. If we follow this thread and we learn how to activate and wake this up, without stepping into the word woke, I think that there's probably nothing we should be daunted by. But if we're in denial, then it's just basically going to sleep in the snowbank and calling it quits. But there's no need for that. We have tools. I don't know if we're going to get to I think it would be good to get people who know a lot more about mitochondria than me for that question. But
okay,
I just know. I mean,
I think
I'll give you a simple. They're the engines of energy in all cells, in every cell in our body.
Right. Right.
and they have DNA that's not human. The origins of it look to go back to, uh, bacteria very early on. And it's fascinating looking at these pathways. The conservation of intelligence in the natural world is stunning. These same neurotransmitters that are communicating within our bodies between organs in the brain and so forth were previously, long before humans or even primates, were messenger molecules that were communicating between species and ecosystems. And so there's like a concentration of what has worked and miniaturizing it in the human nervous system. It's miraculous.
Well, and effectively, these non-human energy cells that are in in every one of your cells, they say that that's where your energy is manufactured. The energy for your to live effectively is manufactured in these mitochondria, and they're matrilineal. They come down through your mother's side. Your energy comes from your mother's line, basically. Interesting factoid, but the level of function of mitochondria has a lot to do with the level of energy you have to go about your day, if I can say it in a sort of a lay
Yeah,
way.
yeah.
And there are things you can do to rebuild that mitochondrial energy. And so, from a very, very simple way, I'm just looking for you to say, or maybe I have to sort of tease it out of you, like get outside and experience sunlight through your eyes without a window that has argon gas, without sunglasses. There literally is something about having your eyes take in sunlight and your skin that is profoundly valuable. Full stop, end of conversation. Do it regularly. A. B. Take your damn shoes off, get outside, walk around in an area that's not a very perfectly manicured lawn, but an area where you have to be, where it's diverse and nuanced. Is that what I heard you say? I mean, there's a couple of basic things. I heard you
You
say
did, and but I
community.
didn't necessarily link mitochondria to some of those. They I'm sure do, but like if you listen to what Gerald Pollack is saying about your body being, all of the molecules of your body essentially are separating into a negative and positive charge. That's energetically a battery. That's
Yeah.
a I think that's a different source of energy than mitochondria, but it probably crosses over some, and definitely with the potential for melanin and sunlight. What they're saying, and I could get you some, there's a book called, this is getting out there a little bit, but, it's definitely worth looking at. There's a book called Melanin, the Master Molecule, and it's Herrera is the guy's last name. But, I you almost have to diverge from the single silver bullet of mitochondria, in order to look at energy, at the larger picture of energy, right? And so you
Yeah.
got the things that are blocking it. You've got the actual nutrients in the food, which is totally turning into, ATP and powering the body, what you can do. And I've watched that ability over 30 some years of people, who were wanting to work trade on farms, and the difficulty of farms trying to get labor, and on and on and on, and so many different clues that this is a very rapidly reducing process. And I think, well, it's coming straight out of the biggest surveys of human health right now, that somewhere between 88% and 94% of all people tested are sub healthy at a metabolic mitochondrial level. I mean,
Yeah.
so that told me that I got to stop just talking about things take work. So until we collectively build the energy budget to get that work done. This is why I backed up to the neurobiology piece, because
Right.
it does contain the gut, it contains the microbiome, it contains digestion, and so forth. So yeah, there's a tremendous amount to unpack. I don't think I made it sound too simple, but I don't want to oversimplify it. People who have done more research than I have, sure can correct me on a few things, but that's where I've gotten to with it. But yeah, very important. I mean, energy is the whole thing about the frog sitting in the water and while it's heating up and not
Yeah.
knowing to jump out, or having a psychological aspect. This is beyond that now. This is not having the mitochondrial energy to jump out. So this is not a minor problem, right?
And this goes
So
back to
anyway,
the time we had 2 years ago when you were here and we were talking about the landing strips and
yep,
the practical skills. So one thing is, what can you do immediately to begin to, energize, harmonize yourself, etc. Obviously, the eating of good food, but the being outside and being with community, etc. Spending time with people, making sure to go out and do things with people. These are all critical things that I think in many cases people's lives are slowly pulling them away from, and they need to be making conscious choices to do differently. But then to actually change your life to not be, an urban, I say, wage slave, to be empowered to live in a different way, in many cases requires a different set of skills and practical capacities that many don't have because they were not brought up with these skills, right? For me, being denatured to a large degree has a lot to do with literally being removed from nature from birth and being brought up and having all of our formative influences, or the vast majority of them, in a very controlled, sterile, sort of, unnatural environment. And that leaves us, as adults without a lot of capacity to engage meaningfully with the world around us. And so, for those of us who are adults and maybe don't want to be spending the rest of our life in this milieu, what's the process of getting out of it? And we've had many conversations about these, landing strips and the sort of the deep, week-long intensive component, and getting those practical skills developed. And, do you want to talk a little bit about that vision or that prospect, or what you see as a strategy and a path forward in that direction? I know you
yeah,
and I've been spending a lot of time on this, but this is a really
yeah.
important
I
piece
mean,
of the puzzle you're bringing. I'm not hearing many other people bring.
I'm still working with Martha on this, and there's going to be some documentation of what we're coming up with, but it is like a five level game of chess, and so it's inherently difficult to communicate to the left brain of a large group of people, and that's where you can make headway in the experiential piece that are very difficult to do in an academic type format.
Yeah.
But there's a lot of stepping stones. You got to have the energy, so that's why I'm starting there. And it's partly, primed because of what I'm seeing, not just in the inner cities, but just really across the board. And then you have to have the skills that I think those can come. We still have a lot of people who know how to do things that, you can figure stuff like that out. But land tenure is a massive one. If you don't have access to long, there's certain things you just tend to not do if you don't have secure tenure over time. You're not going to be
Yeah.
planting your grafted hickory trees and things that take 30 years to get a crop, or something like that. So yeah, the land piece, and that's not just energy based. That's economics. That's really a big part of what the curriculum of those courses that I was talking about is really about. Freedom is that you have to have not just the energy, but you have to have the freedom, which means getting out of debt, which means, and so, like, for example, where I am, I recently stopped talking about it in a general sense and started talking about one working example and the nuts and bolts of that in Kentucky last year. And so, it's a working model. You can call it what you want. It's 10, it's basically like a power of 10. If 10 people can pool what little they have financially together to get a piece of land and figure out how to make decisions, have functional meetings, solve conflicts and things like that, those are those make the other things look kind of small in a lot of ways. We can figure it, like I said, it's like shoveling. We used to have a term, in our cooperative farm thing that I think I'll go shovel the pig shit, right? If somebody wanted to not do something more than that, right? So but because it just takes a level of patience to get to that synergy of 1 + 1 = 3, rather than 10 people coming up with a -100, where you just makes you want to run off and become independent and do your own thing right now. But if you can wade through that mud and get to where it's efficient, that's really what you see in the history of anthropology, of groups of people working together to survive, and with no subsidies. All they had was the sun in the sky and the rain coming and the soil and the plants and animals that they had to work with. And that's a very good practice to do for a while. It's really hard to convey what comes into your being when you do that for even a short amount of time. And so I'm a big advocate of, not necessarily saying everybody has to go off grid, but you have to have the capacity to be off grid and be okay, right? Have backup systems, have resilience. And we could do a whole piece on that. What does that look like at an individual home level? What does it look like with that home embedded in a group of 10, land trust type community? Because there's things that happen that shouldn't happen in every home. I mean, we can look at the Amish community. They've tackled most of this at scale, right? They've decentralized the production. They've got, they've decentralized the wood shops and metal shops and the processing of grains and processing of animals. These are all pieces that you're going to get into in building supply chains. So, it's to keep the nutrients dense, you got to have them local. You could have the best nutrient dense food in the world and ship it halfway across the country, and it's crap by the time it comes out of the package, probably with microplastics in it as well. So there's a lot of work to do. There's full employment here.
Well, there's culture, I think. There's an
Yeah.
opportunity for deeper holistic culture, but then I'm glad you brought us up with the land tenure. That was something I was pushing last week at the presentation about economics and the logistics of how the structure of money and the enclosure of the commons and everything else has left a lot of people profoundly disempowered, as far as I'm concerned, with not having that land tenure. And I guess I grew up with it, but I think in many cases people have not even experienced that in their childhood, and they just don't even know what they're missing. So I guess many of these things are just, you don't even know what you don't know. But
Yeah.
this is great. There's a number of questions here in the Q&A, and we like to try to spend the last half hour engaging people's Q&A. So I'll read them to you if you don't mind, and we'll see if we didn't do a very good job last week in getting as many of the questions answered as we could, because there was lots of long rambling conversations. So try to be more successful with that this week.
Yeah. Practice makes better
Yeah,
anyway.
well, it's a different presenter every week, so it's um, the first question here is from Tom, and he said your insight into methylene blue used by Bobby Kennedy. I don't think I'd heard of this, but you did just bring it up. What is that, or do you have any comments about methylene blue?
Um, I can't do a workshop on it or anything. It's something that's been around for about 150 years. It is a dye, but it has some pretty big effects on mitochondria and cancer. I've got to look at that right now. As I mentioned earlier, I either have brain tumors or some kind of inflammation that's causing this MRI reading, and I decided to, instead of following their what they want to do is a very invasive biopsy process, and I headed for the hills and said I'm gonna treat all of the possible above things simultaneously. So I'm doing a lot of things, and I'm being careful about it, and I'm trying things that may not have um, in some people's opinion enough research done on it. There's a lot out there to look into on it. It's clearly in the ball game, and there's lots of other things that are altering mitochondria as well. There's a complex world out there. We could probably put together um, a resource list of some of them. This has been a
Yeah.
crash course for me. I haven't been into this very long. This was not even 2 months ago. I got this, potential diagnosis, and so I don't think I would have been doing many of these things. I was already growing all of the therapeutic mushrooms, and I'm
Yeah.
making tinctures. I was kind of almost like I was preparing for this. I've got six of the real rock star, anti-tumor, anti-inflammation, all kinds of activators of all sorts in them, of not just the mushrooms, but the other, rock star adaptogens like, rhodiola and curcumin and such. So there's a long list of these things, and I'm not prepared to go into those details yet, just because
Yeah.
I'm being my own guinea pig. I'm not telling anybody else what to do. And I'm not like doing it a lot. I'm pulsing many different things over time.
Yeah.
I don't think there's any risk really. I mean, I know for a fact there's radical risk in everything I was told to do, including the one medication I'm taking that's wreaking havoc on me for anti-seizure medication. But I won't go into the other details.
Yeah.
I think we know what the pharmaceutical industry. So I think that one of the things I'm trying to get at here are using things that are generally regarded as safe, and having positive synergies between these things, these plant intelligences, these plant allies, as opposed to negative synergies of so many side effects, nobody can calculate them, from the silver bullet isolated compounds versus whole plant intelligence. Again, the body knows those. It can recognize them. It activates things that they're familiar with. It throws them into a complete disarray. And you could look at chewing coca leaf in the Andes for adaptation to high elevations, and huge amounts of calcium. And James Duke did a tremendous amount of work on that plant, versus isolating it into crack, right?
Yeah.
It's an example of how stupid it is to isolate things a lot of times, and yet
Yeah.
that's the only game in town if you want to make trillions of dollars and have patents and so forth. But if stuff it's already in your backyard, is very threatening. So
Yeah.
there's a lot going on there. That really wasn't my thing I was going to focus on in this, other than
That's fine. We don't need to
to
spend any more time
that's
on it.
part of
It was just
the tool set. Yeah,
it was
there's
just
a
one of
big
the
tool set out
questions that came
there.
in. Yeah.
But I think the no, I don't mind it. I just don't feel like I'm as experienced in it. It's something very recent for me. I think it does go back to the intuitive part, that I'm like literally waking up with revelations like by the day. This ketosis thing is unbelievable. I've never experienced getting away from glucose and running my body on ketones, and the changes I'm seeing in lots of different ways are stunning. And the amount of energy and the tiny amount of food in comparison I need to eat to feel even better,
Yeah.
is amazing in itself, for inflammation, anti-seizure, anti-cancer, and so forth. I don't think I would have done that even if I did know about it, but you get motivated when you're looking at mortality potentially, right? Um,
100%. I do think that's one of the things we can count on to help get us through this liminal point, if we're
yeah,
going to make
yeah.
it through, is that very visceral driver. Yeah.
Yeah,
Um,
I certainly would. I certainly would stay far away from the rumors that are going around, like what happened with ivermectin during COVID and so forth. That was, terrible information,
yeah.
disinformation that was extremely destructive, and pure lies.
Yeah.
So, and I see them wanting to do that with a lot of things that are dangerous to the $1 trillion, profit levels of pharmaceutical companies. This is part of our immune system, is to spot the bullshit, right?
Yeah.
This is something we can't afford to be fooled over and over again. Once you learn the track record of serial liars, just bypass them, do your own thing. That's the beauty of this kind of Gnostic level intuition to find your own plants in your own landscape. That's what animals do. That's what all
Yeah.
indigenous people do. They weren't waiting around for some expert in a white coat that was going to make a lot of money off of them. So enough said about that.
All right. Thank you. Tom says, protecting livestock from 5G and stray voltage. We are going to have a completely brilliant presenter on that topic who is extraordinarily knowledgeable later in this series. So I think I'll just, unless you have something you feel like you need to say, we can kick that one to a real brilliant.
It's a big deal. It's definitely a big deal, and it's blocking. Basically the way to look at it partly is that there's this beautiful music that the planet is singing, and that humans are creating a static that our bodies can't hear and that it needs. And there's a whole world of sound healing. So that's creating a blockage. And I'm lucky because I can hit one switch in my house and shut off not only all of the Wi-Fi, and I'm too far away from any cell phone towers to have any of that. I can even turn off the 60 hertz electrical current with one button, but most people don't. There are some things out there that are, coherence tools. It's been a while. I've got one that I don't know if it's still producing it, called I think it's called
The
Concerto. It was the
concerto.
same
Yeah,
folks
yeah.
that are doing the
Tenio.
Tenio,
Yep.
folks that came up with it. And there's a larger version of that, but there's a lot of other stuff out there. There's so much coming online right now that we all need to, as a community, sift through and try it, and have the people who are sensitive to these things report back. Some people get migraines just going into a public library
We've got
because
a
of the
we've got
light.
a guy named Joe Sandry who's going to be speaking later in this conference, who's extremely knowledgeable on this topic. So I'm
Great.
happy to have him. I mean, we're going to spend a whole 2 hours on this topic of electromagnetic
Okay.
radiation and all of that, and its implications and how to address it, because it is one of those profoundly negative impacts on our circuitry that we're not necessarily aware of, as far as I'm concerned.
Yeah. And
Um,
there's potential in the technology to do it right and have it enhance our health rather than undermine it. It's not a
yeah,
fixed thing that it has to be a bad
precisely.
thing. It's just a stupid,
Yeah.
people that didn't use their forebrain. They're unimpressive primates that didn't use the very thing that made them unique.
Katrina's got a question, which is maybe a bit of a, as connected to this past one. How can I explain your work in layperson's terms? What spending time inside on a screen is doing to a person?
Yeah. Well, I don't know. I have trouble just coming up with the name of this topic. A lot of times to try to. It's difficult if you're explaining it to people who are bringing a scrutiny that they were trained to bring in an academic type setting of reductionism, and taking it down to its parts separately. This is about the opposite of that, and the part of our neurobiology that's capable of that has been suppressed. So we're really just looking at how to empower that, and using examples of like animal behavior and how people did things before technology, is very helpful. But it's difficult. I don't know of other people that are trying this, and I kind of understand why. It's much easier to be an expert on one thing and just burrow way into it and get very granular. But I don't see that the granularity is all coming together somehow. It's, somebody has to assimilate, and that
Yeah.
holistic capacity of our minds and heart and gut, and bring all those to play, is fully capable. We're just not seeing it. We've crippled it. I don't know if I said it earlier, but I feel like what we have is kind of a neuropathy of sorts, where generally in neuropathy in the body, you're not feeling, you're getting numbness, or you're getting tingling or numbness in your extremities. Well, I'm talking about our extremities being, the stars and the soil and the forests and the whole living system.
Yeah.
We have that ability to feel that, and it's not about hearing about it and strapping it on intellectually. It's about actually feeling it. And that's what happens when you're engaged with these animals and plants, and they're your life, they're your survival. You don't have another. I could easily find other sources, but the practice of living locally and deeply engaged, I don't think there's an alternative for it. This is how we got here. We traded that away. We somehow
Yeah.
made the rationalization that mass production was going to make it easier, and with 70 million people on psychiatric meds, I don't think that worked. But
It's okay. Yeah, it's
I
good.
just need to yeah. So anyway, I'm not sure what more there is to say about that on how to talk about the big picture. I don't think it's going to be a thumbnail.
Well, that's
It's
I mean,
difficult.
the problem I've
I've
had
struggled
is
with it my whole life, and the best I've got is having 8 to 14 days, morning till night, and unpacking it. But so it's almost ridiculous to try to do it in an hour, which is what we just did. And then having
yeah.
this second hour to clarify is good, but still it's a lot.
So the short answer effectively is go unplug for a week and then report back. Explaining logically is not necessarily going to cover the bases. It's getting that visceral experience of the unplug that is the
Well,
empowering thing and provides the context. And I don't know if you went into it fully, but I mean this is part of what we've been discussing and wanting to do with local chapters and in collaboration
yeah,
with all kinds of wonderful people around the planet who are setting up, their little education demonstration farms and community farms and things. I mean, there are these places around the planet. There's so many amazing people doing their bit to have a space where things like this can happen. And having a curriculum
yep,
would be a real deep, lived, visceral, experiential curriculum that could provide context for people who
yeah.
haven't had that experience. I think can be profoundly life-changing, and that's what you've been doing for 30 years. You didn't even get into that, but um, maybe
Right. Yeah. To be able to taste the talk about nutrient density, and you could talk all day long, but to be in a place where you're picking things and you're eating them, and all of the cells of your body are being talked to in a different way, not through that filter of the left
yeah,
brain, is profound. And the same thing
yeah,
with hearing the bird calls and identifying them, going to the creek, looking at the animal tracks, and just
yeah,
tracing everything in your life back to where it came from is
yeah.
something you can't really do or never will be able to do with an exonervous system. And so we
And
need
by
to
extra
basic
nervous system, you say extra nervous system. I don't think people actually mean what you say. So many of these words you just throw off. You're talking about the electronics, all
yeah,
the things we have
the
supporting us that are
smartphone.
the phones. Yeah,
Yeah, the
exactly.
things that
Yeah,
the things that we used to do without those are atrophying. We're not using them, and we're losing them.
yeah,
And so we've really done is this clever, monkey has come up with a way to take what it used to be able to do on the inside and putting it into an external technology that other people can control, and there's no way you can repair it and fix it or make it. So that looks just like pure crazy to me. But I don't pretend to convince anybody of that. I just,
yeah,
for personally, I'm just always prepared to lose it.
yeah,
I'll use it, but I'm not going to like put my life on it. I'm
yeah,
getting backup systems in place. So one of the other things I didn't mention that is kind of part of these courses, and it was for the urban folks, is to because when we brought them down to the farm and we walked them around, and even the young people in college and things, you get this big-eyed thing going on at first. They're all excited, and then you watch it dim out as in their internal dialogue is saying, I don't have the money, I don't have the land, I don't have the knowledge, all the things you were saying. And so in order to kind of create some empowerment there, I put together something I'm calling a lifeboat, which is basically a micro living situation that you can throw in the trunk of a car,
yeah,
with basically 4 season shelter, a really hardcore tent that can, from Norway, that can take 80-mile-an-hour winds and 40 below zero with a wood stove in it and a water heating system and a oven and refrigeration, 3 to 4 ways to cook, when it's not cold outside, solar ovens, water filters, water, a shower sink, all that stuff, and a folding solar panel and a battery-based generator that you can then, because one of the things that happens when you actually use that, even if you don't use it, it's gonna ease the anxiety, because it's like in their mind now they've got a backup system.
Yep.
The anxiety is partly because people know damn well they're way out on a limb. There's a storm coming. They got no tools to figure out what to do. So, part of what happens in these courses is that you get these empowering, you're putting it into a context of things that are working already, right? You've got shelter, you've got energy, you've got water systems that have been developed, you've got food systems, all that stuff's there. So it feels safe to learn this stuff, because it's not, nobody's just jerking you around. This is like a real thing that's working. And so I think but if you do use it, there's this other thing that happens, where when you put that panel out in the sun and you look at the digital numbers coming in, that you got this budget all of a sudden, you got this economy, this personal economy of it, and you start booting up these questions. Wow, I can do that with this, and then if I put 2 solar panels on it, I can do that. And if I, pretty soon you got everything you need, and you're watching it in real time. You get, I don't know. For me, it's habit forming. I can just like look at the cloud cover in the sun and know exactly how much power is coming in, and I'm thinking ahead when the batteries are gonna fill up, and okay, at that point I'm gonna pump water, I'm gonna run the vacuum, do some laundry, roast my coffee, et cetera, et cetera. So you're building out your actual economy in an alternative way from just being completely powerless if your present sources go down.
Yep.
It's interesting because, not that I made it through the Cub Scouts. I was too crazy and wild, and my other friends got booted out. But what I thought was interesting is that, you get a badge when you're a kid as a Boy Scout for being prepared. But as an
Yeah.
adult, if you're prepared, you're a prepper and you're a right-wing nut job and you're paranoid. It's not paranoid if things are, if there's a rational reason to have backup systems, right? But that's like just as crazy as all the other stuff we said, eat margarine, not butter, stay out of the sun, go down the whole list of things that are completely insane. And everybody just like drank the Kool-Aid. I mean,
Yep.
this is it's a mental health epidemic. I've known that since I was a teenager, but now I'm putting it into different terms that you don't have to talk about crazy. You talk about, you put it in terms of your neurological system just needing to be upgraded. And that includes the mind, but it also includes the gut and the heart and all the pieces that we've left out of the equation. So I like it. It's much more of a better, more holistic language than getting into psychology per se, in isolation of the gut and the heart and other things.
Beautiful.
Yeah.
Beautiful. We've got 4 questions left and 10 minutes technically. Let's see if we can. I love your rambles, but yeah. So Chanya says, and maybe you've already answered this to some degree. For those that are denatured or feeding the microbes in their body the wrong fuel, what is the best starting point for mitochondrial energy restoration? Focusing on reducing oxidative stress and clearing damaged mitochondria, or on fueling them with the right nutrients, or both?
Well, I think it depends on the individual and your terrain, but really looking at that whole terrain that I mentioned, and then depends on how much money and time you got. So where I tend to go with people on a very low budget is exactly what I said: is the breath work, the sunlight, the grounding, the get your water right, hydrate, and then go into nutrient dense foods, and then depending on the individual, I mean, the naturopaths I'm working with, which I haven't done yet, want me to do blood work for toxins, some genetic background stuff, which I'm not opposed to, but I don't put a lot of stock in it. I think that what I think I understand about the sort of the mind over matter, the thing with the Dispenza folks are doing, is it's more the epigenetics versus the genetics piece, the nature and nurture. And I think the more that's being unraveled, it's looking like the nurture part is more than we used to think. And yeah, I mean, all of the above. And again, follow your heart on it. Really do some thinking. Go walk in the woods and ponder it. I mean, there was an Amish healer that I knew that he back in the early days when he was still farming, he got so many people wanting him to treat them that he had to just go full-time medical. But he just couldn't stand the thought of shooting a horse because it broke its leg. So he got really good at broken bones. And then it was a matter of time before a guy fell off a roof and broke his arm and came to him. And then one day a woman came with third-degree burns that, from 600 miles away in a taxi, and he couldn't turn her away, and he didn't know what to do. And he walked out in the forest and, just, prayed and thought about it and went into that intuitive state of need, and came out with an astounding system eventually of this salve using certain herbs, and then using a second skin with steamed burdock leaves, cooling them off, of course, putting the salve on and replacing that. And very interesting story. But he basically, this is how it works when you're under duress and you have to get information quickly from this. I guess the way I describe it is that every intelligent being eventually comes to a point where they realize that they're simultaneously finite and infinite, and they have to come up with a language for the finite to speak to the infinite and get information back. And that's really what we're talking about with this intuitive. I don't have good enough words to talk about what I want to say. So I think that's the answer again. It's like there's a lot out there. I can't describe what I do exactly. I get drawn to things that there's little signs, all day long going on. It's like, okay, I'm going to go that way. I'm going to work with that person. I'm going to, do this or that. There's no equation for it. And so I find myself kind of getting distracted by a lot of the people who mean well about doing the testing and this, that, and the other. I just need to be, and it's been wonderful. Last month I've been on the farm I can't drive, so I'm not going anywhere. Friends come and visit, and I'm working in the garden, I'm walking in the woods, I'm going along the creek and this, that, and the other, and it's very healing. It's the right thing for me to be doing, and part of that comes out of that is more time spent in this intuitive space, and you get more and more clarity that way. There's a lot to unpack there. I've tried to include that in these courses, and it's very difficult. Some people are more ready than others. And it's not an easy thing. But you got 3 more questions, so I'm going to keep it short.
That was great. I love all your what unravels every time you start talking about something. Ben says, "Thank you, Mark. One big question I have is, what are the areas or topics that you are unsure about? Where do you still have questions and are working on better understanding?"
Oh man, I've got lots of questions. I mean, I think that some of these things I just pointed at, I'm not sure about, like the melatonin, for example, but I gotta follow that, rabbit down that hole to figure that out, because that's huge. I mean, that's like that. If what it looks like it's true, it's the chlorophyll of animals, right? And so there's like a whole other pathway, and there's some really good reason to believe it in terms of how turtles and frogs are going to the bottom of the lake, burrowing into the mud all winter long for 3 or 4 months. And how are they breathing? How are they getting oxygen? The premise is that with that melatonin can split water into oxygen and hydrogen, and it can put it back together again, and so forth. But so that's one. I mean, I could probably look at almost everything I just said and say I'm not sure completely about anything, but I test it on a regular basis, and I've put my own, skin in the game. I'm not, I'd like people to do that rather than to just believe anything I say. I'm just trying to give you some reference points, tips on types of thinking and how to tie pieces together and where the pay dirt is likely to be. But all of this is just kind of mining for, gold in a sense.
Yeah.
I'm sure I could come up with a bunch more. What are the things that need to be studied? I do think that that people are getting close for like cancer right now. This Dr. Seafried, there's like it thrives on glucose, for example. That's why the ketone thing is big. But it can what is being found out is that it can also cancer is like it's like a pre-oxygen environment Earth type of lifestyle, right? It can operate without oxygen. It can ferment glutamine, and it can create acids from glutamine fermentation and create a little environment of acidic environment around a tumor, and then it can then feed it with the byproducts of the fermentation. So then you got to downcycle glutamine with these different herbs and things that are, I'm leaning toward herbs. Some of the doctors that are the closest on it, I think, are using other medicines. But so that's a big deal. And I think as Nasha and others are moving toward, the metabolic approach to a lot of different diseases. I mean, I would use a lot of what I'm doing now, whether it was diabetes, whether it was, X, Y, and Z, almost, Jerry Brunetti talked about this back, 15 years ago. His talk on the fires within blew me out of the water, and the personal conversations I had with him. So these were all precursors to this period of time we're in now. I mean, we are standing on the shoulders of others, and it should be acknowledged. But again, he had cancer. He was highly motivated to figure this out. He was working with livestock, then moved into human health secondarily. And so, yeah, we get thrown these challenges, and then if we're good at solving them, then we've broken incredible new ground, and there's plenty to do. I think that the thing that I would say about that last question has to do with the social part. I asked John Kemp a while back, about what can we learn beyond agronomy from the Amish community, and how is it even possible without religion to have intergenerational community that really works over time and it gets to critical mass to the point where they can all just pitch in a few bucks and pay for any sick person's needs because their lifestyle is so healthy, they don't have nearly as much. But if you're seeing the cancer rates and the diabetes rates getting to the point, over half, that means that you got the other half of the population has to take care of the sick people, and there's nobody left to do everything else. That's the tipping point we're at, and that's on top of all kinds of other things. So we got to get to prevention. We got to get to really use the circuitry that we have to understand how to prevent the most negative outcomes and how to promote the most positive outcomes, or in the least negative and the most positive. And again, we're in a very challenging time. I mean, I don't kid myself. I don't even dangle the carrot in front of myself anymore that I used to about what's going to happen. I'm going day by day, week by week, just doing the best I can. And I think that's a better place to be, because otherwise you're setting yourself up to get incredibly depressed. So the social piece, what is
The social piece. The social piece is
how can
critically important.
how
Yeah.
can we stimulate that? Because people are, I mean, even 5 years ago, I had about 100 times more hope. But something happened during COVID that split people down the middle of every group I know of. And I just every family, every group I know of is arguing about certain topics. The algorithms are dividing people on social media. There's just crazy disinformation. They can come up with hundreds of bogus scientific studies that make something look true. We're going into a time that you're not going to be able to trust very much unless it's coming out of your own internal circuitry.
Yeah.
I wish it wasn't true, but so
The answer is within is the short answer. It's just
what?
about, the answer is within is the short
Yeah,
answer.
yeah.
And that's
Yeah.
where we have to trust our own internal knowing and our, and not, like you said, not outsource all these functions, the truth really is within, and all the deeper levels of being, etc. Yeah.
And that includes recognizing the people we can trust. It includes, the gut level sense rather than,
Yeah.
somebody wrote a bunch of papers. I don't know. But yeah, the intuitive piece is probably the biggest part of all this that I've been talking about. And it goes with not to it probably sounds like I'm trashing the left brain. I'm not at all. I'm really about balancing it and using the best of our deductive capacities. And there's place for reductionism. There's a place for all of those things that it does well. I mean, I use to me, the hospitals are incredibly good at mechanical fixes, right? You know, I had a broken femur that they were phenomenal on, you know, so I use the right tool for the job. I'm not going to leave healing up to them. I'm not going to leave, you know, getting to the causes of what it was up to them. Just use the tool for the right thing. You know, somebody was, Warren the other day, we were doing something and he was pounding something with a pipe wrench. And he said, my dad used to say, there's a hammer for that. But anyway, that's the point.
Yeah. Beautiful. Well, this has been a rollicking 2 hours, and I hope people have got a lot from it. I'm guessing listening to your words, you know, 2 or 3 times probably will more and more will be unpacked. There's so much you've shared, and I deeply appreciate you and everything you've done. And yeah, look forward to this conversation continuing.
Yeah.
But thank
Yeah.
you
Well,
very much.
totally welcome. How many people we got it from? What kind of distribution? I'm just curious.
I didn't even check to see where people were from around the planet.
I
It
guess
was
it's 3 to 5 in the morning or something, or it was in Australia, New Zealand. So there's probably not a lot from there. But if there
it's
are,
mostly
they're
North America,
really
Europe, and
committed. And
Africa, I think. Yeah.
okay.
Oh, there's somebody else. Sarah's
All
there from
right. Well,
Europe, Australia. Yeah. Great. Thanks a lot, Mark.
well, sure. Yeah.
Okay.
Thanks for hanging in there, everybody. Uh, Appreciate your attention and hope we can meet up sometime face to face.
Absolutely. Beautiful.